All right, thanks so much for being here today. We're going to continue on our documentation series, and today we're going to talk about documenting your PPP forgiveness if you are applying using the EZ form. So this is the 3508 EZ form. If you are using that form, or if you think you're eligible to use that form for PPP forgiveness, then this video is all for you. So if that sounds good and you need help with this type of thing, go ahead and make sure you are subscribed to this channel. Please give this video a thumbs up if this is helpful, because it totally helps us out. And then please put any questions, comments in the comment section below, and we will try to get to as many of those as we possibly can. All right, well, the first thing I want to say is that all of the documentation topics that we're talking about, there's a lot of overlap, because really the banks are really needing kind of the same thing. It's just kind of to what detail and what level, and what do we need to prove out to the bank. So a lot of what we're going over here is actually the same that we went over for the 3508S. So if this looks familiar and you watch that video, that's why, because a lot of it is the same. Now I'm going to interject on a couple things that are different. So when you go in and you apply for forgiveness, remember to always keep that PPP application that you've already filled out, maybe just the front part of it that has the, your basic information about your loan and whatnot. Go ahead and fill that out and be ready for filling out your bank portal. When it's time to go online and fill out all that information, you'll have all the basics already ready to go. Okay, so keep that in mind. You are going to need that, similar to what we did with the S form. All right, so when you go to apply for your loan, you're going to need a couple things. The first is your filled out application, and your bank may not actually accept it as in paper form, like what you pull from the SBA website directly. However, it's good to go ahead and have the form filled out, because your bank is going to ask you all the same questions in digital format. So they're just going to ask you to fill in the boxes on their web form, and it's just going to go into their version of the 3508 form, their application form, just depending on which one is appropriate for you. So go ahead and fill that out as much as you possibly can, okay? That's the first thing. Then you're going to need proof of your payroll costs and then your non-payroll costs. And that's how we're going to break it out for this video. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what documents you need to prove out your payroll costs. Now, payroll costs can either be the easiest thing or the most complicated. If you have a payroll provider, this should be fairly easy for you to prove out these costs. So we're going to go over exactly what you need to do. So the first thing that you need to provide proof for is your cash compensation to your employees. So this could look like, and what it probably will look like, is third-party payroll reports. Third-party payroll reports are the best evidence that you can give to the bank to prove out your payroll costs, okay? And go back and look at, I did a video that said how to read payroll reports to apply for forgiveness. I went through Paychex, Gusto, and QuickBooks payroll. But essentially, if you have ADP or you have another form, it's going to be, if you get the gist of what we're looking for there, that will be helpful no matter what payroll system you use, okay? So you're going to need to provide the payroll reports for the cash compensation during the time and what you're trying to prove out the expense for. The second thing that you're going to need is tax forms, and they say or equivalent third-party payroll reports that show the taxes paid to both the federal government and your state and local authorities. So let's say you pay quarterly unemployment taxes, you're going to want to include that report for the overlapping time period of when your covered period is. So if your covered period started in May, but your quarter ended in June, you want to include the June report, and then it might also include September, right? Because especially if you have the 24-week covered period, you're going to include September, and you're actually you might be required to go ahead and include the December 31st reports as well. I haven't seen any bank ask for those yet, but it is a possibility we might want to consider, okay? Now, that is to prove out your taxes and then your cash compensation. The third thing is that you will need either payment receipts or canceled checks or account statements showing that you've paid to prove out healthcare contributions on the employer side, as well as retirement contributions on the employer side. Okay, so if you're trying to get those costs covered with the PPP loan, you're going to have to prove that you made the payment and that the agency or the business receiving those premiums or those contributions, that they received it. So let's say you're using Primera and you're paying your healthcare into Primera. Primera probably has a statement on that side that shows that a payment was received and what the new balance is. And then the next month it'll show the payment that was received and the new balance. So that proves to the banks that you actually did spend the money on healthcare, right? They also are going to, if you don't for some reason have account statements, you can put your payment receipts, like if you paid online and you got a receipt coming back for it, you can do that. Additionally, a canceled check. So if you physically write a check, you can go into your online banking and print out like what the canceled check looks like after it passes through the bank, okay? Now, the big thing about that is that we can't just rely on the employer reports from the payroll provider. Because a lot of times on your payroll reports, it'll say exactly what your healthcare contributions are during the period, but they're saying that's not enough. They're saying that they also want to see those payments actually going out to whoever it is that has the retirement account or the health insurance company, okay? All right, so when it comes to payroll costs, one thing that we have to prove out for the EZ form that we didn't have to prove out for the S form is that if you checked that little box that said, hey, we did not reduce our employees or our average paid hours between January 1st and the end of the covered period, then we are going to need to provide some kind of proof of that. So what I'm seeing is I'm seeing people pull their payroll reports and prove out how many average FTEs were as of January 1, and then pull out that same report and do the same calculation as of the end of the covered period. And you are going to need to do that comparison just to provide that and prove it to your bank. Okay, so I have gone through this process with a couple banks so far, and an Excel spreadsheet seemed to do just fine as far as evidence of that comparison. So that is the payroll cost that all of those documents would help you prove out payroll costs. Now, if you do not have a third-party payroll provider and you've been doing this, somehow you're getting around it and you're not doing that piece, I would say you are going to have to provide bank account statements showing any payroll costs that you're trying to get forgiveness for. The other thing that I would say, which is not specifically in the instructions, is that if you are trying to claim owner's compensation for yourself under the PPP, then you're going to have to prove your owner's compensation amounts. And so they're going to ask you for 2019. So if you're a sole proprietor, you're going to need to provide your 2019 Schedule C. If you are a partnership, you're going to need to provide 2019 K1s. And then if you are S Corp or C Corp and you pay yourself with W-2 wages, you're going to need to provide your 2019 W-2. All right, now I don't know why they're not asking for that when we actually look at the forgiveness instructions. However, banks are asking for this. So I'm telling you guys because I'm seeing that as something that we're going to have to provide one way or the other. All right, so once we get into non-payroll costs, I want to go over this with you guys. Now, remember with non-payroll costs, if you've been watching my videos for a while, you probably will remember this, but anything we try to claim for non-payroll costs has to be an expense that the business was incurring before, basically pre-COVID. So before February 15th, 2020, that thing that we're going to try to get forgiveness for had to already be in place. So a rent or lease would already have to be in place, or maybe a utility that you already use. These things would have to have already been existing in the business as an expense before February 15th if we're going to include them as allowable costs for the purposes of PPP. All right. So let's go over real quick what type of documentation you need to provide. So if you are trying to claim for business mortgage interest, there's a couple things you need to. So if you're paying a payment for a mortgage, most likely you've got principal and interest both combined in your payment, unless you're doing an interest-only type loan. Now, when this happens, we're not going to be able to just show our check to the mortgage company and have that be enough. You're going to have to provide something that also shows the breakout between interest and principal. So they're saying that you can either provide the amortization schedule, which is that detailed amortization that shows the principal amount, the amount of interest charged per period, and it's usually like a very long Excel spreadsheet or maybe PDF or something. But it will show the breakout between principal and interest, and then the payment amount. You can provide that and receipts or canceled checks for the payment that was made, or you can show lender account statements from February 2020 through the end of the covered period, or February 2020 and then during the covered period. I don't think they're really going to care about March and April if you got your loan in May, but have them ready. I told you guys this from the very beginning, is have this information ready because they are going to care about it. And look, here we are having to provide it. So hopefully you were saving those along the way. But those lender account statements would show principal and interest, so make sure it shows it on there. And then it'll also show when a payment has been made and then what the next one is due. So in that situation, they're not really asking for canceled checks or receipts, okay? Because the statement is showing that it was received on the other side. Now, if you are trying to get your rent or your lease payments covered by the PPP, you're going to have to provide a couple things. So first, you have the option of providing the lease or the rental agreement, and then again, receipts or canceled checks showing that the payment went through. Because you could have a lease, but that doesn't mean you're making payments. So they have to have that kind of, hey, we need to know that the payments were actually made in order to then count that as an expense, right? And they're going to see that the lease, they're going to see when that was put in place. So if it was put into place like days after you got your PPP loan, sorry, that's not going to work. We're not going to be able to do that. But if it was put into place 3 years ago, and it's a non-issue, okay? So it just has to be in place before February 15th. Now, the third thing, or the other option you have, if you don't have a lease and those canceled checks, you can also get the lessor account statements. So if you're whoever you're renting from, if they give you account statements and they're showing that rent was paid and more was due, and rent was paid and more was due, then it shows again that kind of in and out from that third party, because then that shows that it's actually been paid, okay? That your rent has actually been paid. And those, again, similar to like with the mortgage interest, you need to have it from February 2020 showing that it was in place, and then during the covered period. Now, the third thing that is a non-payroll cost that we can apply for forgiveness for are business utility payments. And these are pretty simple. What you're going to need is you're going to need a copy of the invoice for the bill of whatever the utility was, and then you're going to need payment. So you're going to need receipts or canceled checks or account statements showing that it has been paid over time. Okay, so you remember, it kind of goes back to that principle of, did you owe it and did you pay it? You need to have two pieces of information there to make sure that the expense is valid. Did you owe it? Did you pay it? Okay, so owing it is things like the rental agreement. It's things like the bills, the utilities, or the account statements. And then did you pay it? Cancel checks, receipts, and account statements showing that your amount has been credited on the statements. Okay? Now, one thing to remember here is that you need to remember that the amount you're applying for forgiveness for needs to match to some sort of documentation. So if your rent is $200 a month and you're trying to apply for 6 months of rent, then you need to have $1,200, because remember 6 times 200 is $1,200, $1,200 worth of proof showing that you had those legitimate expenses, okay? So you need to have 6 $200 checks, canceled checks, or you need to have your statements for those 6 months showing that those payments were received each month, Okay, so the big deal is that we need to match the amount that we're asking for to the actual documentation. So, there's no gaps of information, because if the bank looked and all you had was, the lease, they're going to go, well, this is incomplete documentation, and they're going to come back and ask you for more information. All right, so that's all of the stuff that the bank can ask for. And remember, you only need to submit documentation up to the amount of your PPP loan. So if let's say your PPP loan was $40,000, however, you had $80,000 of eligible expenses when you roll in all these things, you don't have to include all of that. So that's your choice. You can choose, like, if it's easy for you to just document payroll by itself and that covers all $40,000 of your expense or your PPP loan, then just go with that. All right, so now that we've already covered what the bank will need, we also need to remember that audit file that we need to bulk up. Okay, so there's a couple things you specifically need if you are filing the easy form. So you're going to need evidence that your salaries and wages were not reduced more than 25% from January to the end of the covered period. So payroll reports comparison would do just fine. Very similar to what we provided for the proof that we didn't reduce employees or average paid hours down. It's going to be a very similar type reports, just related to salaries specifically. And you need to make sure that each employee is listed individually on there. We can't just do total gross salaries, okay? The other thing that you're going to want to keep kind of in the back of in your audit file is any employees that you provided job offers to, or any refusals that you had, any terminations for cause or voluntary, any employment movement. You want to document those things, okay? So if that's a letter of resignation or a retirement date, or maybe a disciplinary action that you had to have, all those things just need to be documented. That could be like a note to the file. It could be, an email from an employee. It could be lots of different things, or, notes attempting to rehire somebody and they never responded to an offer. All of those things should be kept in a file, okay? Now, if you checked the box that said you were unable to operate, or you had to reduce your operations because of a shutdown of some sort related to COVID and health requirements, then you want to save any documentation related to that. So if you have shutdown orders, if you have executive orders from your governor, or if it's a local city ordinance or something like that, you want to make sure that you save all of that documentation. Or if you had multiple different locations that were affected all by different ones, you want to save everything. And again, just really anything related to the PPP loan, you cannot over document. If you think it would help support your case that you really did need to use this funds, and this is what you used it on, and clearly it's been used on the appropriate things like payroll costs and whatnot, then again, please just keep it in your file. It does not hurt anybody to have a little extra documentation in your audit file. All right, well, that's the 3508 easy form. Hopefully that was helpful. Please give this video a thumbs up if it was, and please share this with anybody else that you think might benefit from this type of information. Thanks, you guys. Thanks for being here.